Thank you. Welcome, everyone, again. I have the great pleasure of introducing Jerry and Ozzy here to you. I'm sure since we got such a big response to this webinar, most of you already know their great work and are very interested in hearing from them. So I'll just say a little bit. Our session today is called Our Healing Medicine is Within Us. And that is so apropos for the work that they do. Because for those of you who aren't as familiar with National Compadres Network, I mean, when I think of them, what I think is la cultura cura. I mean, that's been always what I think about. The ways that they use culture to heal. Their mission is actually to strengthen and reroute the capacity of individuals, families, and communities to honor and rebalance and redevelop the authentic identity, values, traditions, and indigenous practices of the Chicano, Latino, indigenous raza as the path to the honoring of all our relationships and of our lifelong well-being. And that is evident in all of their work. I want to tell you a little bit about each of them. Jerry, but I want to start because, we can give you, I always think whenever you do like bios, you can say a lot about a person, but it doesn't tell you about the person. It tells you about what they've done, a lot of times great things, but it doesn't tell you about who they are. And so I want to tell you about my very first interaction with Los Compadres Network, because it really gives you an idea of who they are. I met Jerry at a conference when I was like 30, it was like 20, I don't even want to say my age, but it was like more than 20 years ago. It was one of those big conferences, 2,000 or 3,000 people, probably like a national child abuse clearinghouse kind of an event. And he was the keynote speaker there. It was probably 1999 or 2000. I was like an advocate who was working in the field, who had just gotten this big job at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges and didn't even know what I was doing yet, really. But he was the keynote there, and he just touched and resonated everything he said to me so much. And so I got in line with all the other people that get in line after those events to just shake somebody's hand and say thank you. And I was able to tell him a little bit, very, very briefly about who I am. And I really would love to talk to him more. And fortunately, he did as well. And so he just, asked me to wait a few minutes so he could talk. And as we were able to continue talking, he actually invited me because, like I said, he was the keynote. He was the special person there. He was the one everybody wanted to hear from. And he was now leaving as I was, to fly back to the places where we came from. And they had a limo. I remember he had like a nice car that was taking him back to the airport. And neither one of us had enough time to talk. And he's like, well, and I go, I'm going to the airport. And he's like, oh, I'm going too. You want to just ride with me? So I got to ride in his limo back to the airport, but it gave us this opportunity to have this full conversation and really get to know each other. I remember when I got dropped off, he gave me copies of his books. I want to just say, when I say who he is, this was at the time, a stranger who invited me into his world, and who since that day has always accepted me as family. And even when we got on this call today, Ozzy was Hola Familia. That is who Los Compadres Network is they are an organization who operates with their heart, who knows that all of our healing comes within. And I can't express enough how important they've been to my life, to my trajectory, to all the work that I've done. They are an exceptional, probably one of the most exceptional organizations in this country. And we're really lucky to have them here with us today. So I really want to thank you all. Encourage you to go to their website and read their bios. I'll tell you a couple of things about them that I think are kind of highlights. But basically, Jerry's been doing this. It says on the website for 40 years, but I think it's even more than that now. You guys need to update that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he's considered a national expert, international expert. He's very well known. I remember thinking even back then when I heard, he'd gotten the what is that called? The Champions of Change Award from President Clinton. many years ago. He has a whole lot of accolades. One thing I learned about Ozzy recently, because we're friends, so we can say Ozzy now, right? With Oswaldo Cruz Sr., is that he came into these programs as a teen father and now runs those. And that's exactly the kind of people that should be doing this work. And so again, I encourage you to find out. He has a 15-year background doing this work, working with men in all kinds in schools, in college campuses, and juvenile detention centers. So I encourage you to go to their website and find out more about him. But I don't want to take any more time away from them. I just wanted to make sure you knew what incredible people we had with us today. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jerry and Ozzy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ruby. And, I want to thank you all for inviting us and partnering with us on this, Ruby. And, obviously people that know you know that you guide and advocate for amazing work for the healing, the health and well-being of all people and especially women and children. So thank you for welcoming us that way and acknowledging us that way as well. And I want to just thank all the listeners, anyone that's listening, just thank you for showing up and being here today. I'm really, blessed and pleased to be with who I call my nephew, Ozzy, because that's the way we are. We believe we're relatives and connected that way. And if you were to come sit with us and eat with us, then you can become a relative too. And then if we go to your house, we expect to eat. So it's all part of a relationship. But we're pleased to really be with you today. And we're gonna, in an hour and 15 minutes, really attempt to share with you what my mom has been trying to teach me all my life, what my dad tried to do the best he could, and what my compañera Susana is always making sure, that I'm a reflection of that, and my children and my grandchildren too. So el hombre noble, the sacred manhood. We amongst ourselves say que somos casi nobles, right? We're almost there. We're not quite. We got a lot of work to do, and we do. So, I'm honored to be with Ozzy today. I'll do a more formal introduction of myself after I let Ozzy speak and welcome you all that way.
Thank you, Maestro, and welcome, relatives. Those of you that are listening in from your private space, shared space, and if you're driving, con cuidado, be cautious. But I want to thank you for making time to join us today, and I want to encourage you all as I lean in, for you all to lean in with us, so that we can have great interaction, dialogue, so that we can continue to learn from each other and grow together. But I really do want to acknowledge NCAP for allowing us the opportunity to share a little bit of what we do in our work, what we've seen, what we've experienced, what we know works, to be able to share that with all of you that are listening, in hopes that there's something that we share today that you can take back to not just your communities and your work, but also to your families, in reference to those values that we know that exist, that support us working and being in good relationship with others. And so I want to briefly introduce myself. I'm Osvaldo Cruz Caro Dueñas, Sr., but known across many communities as Ozzy. And I like to kid around to say, as my mother-in-law, rest in peace, used to say Asi, or as my father-in-law says, Osi, as you better be well behaved, you better be walking right. And so I welcome all of those because it's a part of who I am and my identity. I am a husband to Jacqueline Cruz, father to Osvaldo Cruz Jr., Alexandria Cristo Cruz, Daniel Javier Cruz, and Sofia Cruz. And the reason why I mention my family is because they're the reason why I do the work that I do. And they are my compass, they are my gauge, they are the reason why I constantly reflect on how I can continue to be better. As Maestro has mentioned, casi nobles, right? It's continuing to strive to work to represent myself well, but to show up in a good way for all my relations. And so in addition to that, I want to mention my mom's name, Maria Carmen Caro, who is now retired and lives in the state of Jalisco. And then my father, may he rest in peace, Jose Javier Cruz, who didn't have the opportunity, resources, Zoom, if you will, to receive these lessons, or at least be reminded, right? And so I want to acknowledge him as I pass it over to Maestro.
Yeah, thank you, Ozzy. And as we begin, you see that Ozzy recognizes, and that's part of that sense of sacred manhood, is that we don't walk alone. that, when I was a kid, my mom we'd leave the house, say, "Pórtase bien," behave. But what it really meant is when you walk out this house, you represent all of us. Whatever you do is going to reflect on me, on your dad, on your grandmas, your brothers, your sisters, a todos. And not only that, we recognize your whole culture, because what one of us do often reflects, and it really, points to why we began to introduce ourselves, and me introducing myself, that I come from Maria Suso Lague Ramos, and my mom from Chihuahua, Mexico. She was Tarahumara and Mexicana. My dad, Jorge Perez Teo, that comes from Yanaguana or San Antonio. We're Tapilan, Covitecan, and Mexicano, but my dad would say he's a Texan, right? Soy Tejano, And I didn't understand the implications of why he just called himself a Tejano, because in those times, especially, to be a Mexicano was not good, and to be an Indio was worse, So the whole oppression of your identity, of who you were. So my dad just called himself a Tejano, and met my mom, and they had 6 kids, some born in Texas and some was born in California. And I was raised in South Central LA in a Black-Brown community, a barrio there in Compton, and learned a lot about life, in that way, in that place. And part of the teachings that we come across and share today will be those teachings. But we always begin by introducing who we are. I am the partner of Susana, and honestly and directly, she is the corazón. She carries the medicine. She is the heart, the rhythm, the heartbeat, the spirit of our family, and I say that, very openly, but also realistically too, because, so before I spoke today, before I got ready to speak, she blessed me up. She gave me the bendición, and before people call me and say, "Can you go speak?" Let me go check. Let me go check. And it's not just that whole thing of, get her permission, but get her blessing, because she has a spirit that she carries that knows, yes, you should go here. No, you shouldn't. And it's not about control. It's not about that binary that Western society puts us in, but it's about when you make that connection, that sacred connection, and you trust, when someone says, "Hey," and my mom used to do it in a different way. "Mom, can we go out?" "No, mijo, tengo un presentimiento. I got a feeling." And I didn't respect that feeling, because I go, "Mom, I got a feeling too. Shoot, got a feeling it's gonna be a good party," right? And I was already getting indoctrinated, colonized, in a Western way, of thinking my mind was more significant than my heart and my spirit, right? And just in that was taking things away. So I want to acknowledge my 5 kids and 6 grandkids as well, and so many nieces and nephews, and that we're all part of. And if you notice, we probably took about 10 minutes just to get started, which is a very cultural way. That if you come from a indigenous family, a culturally based family, you may have had a dad like mine that on the way to your relative's house, he begin to scold you before you just when you get to your aunt's house, when you walk in the house, before you run and play, you hug and kiss everybody. We had to hug and kiss everybody. It took half an hour to get in the door, right? But again, it's part of that honoring. And when we talk about sacred manhood, when we talk about Hombre Noble, when you talk about that medicine that is within us, that's what we're talking about. Do you have the values to respect, others, to see them, to acknowledge them, to embrace them, to live recognizing that everything that you do impacts all of that, and all of us. So we intentionally start this workshop with for some of you, it's like Sacred Manhood. What's that? Where are they at, right? But what are you talking? What do you guys think? Well, yeah, we recognize that the narrative, especially for men of color, especially for indigenous men, for Mexicano men, for African American men, for disenfranchised men, and especially if you work in the area of domestic violence or child abuse or child welfare or the juvenile justice system, it's like, where are they at? Because you see the woundedness, you see the wounded men, and maybe even in your own family, you say, well, ¿dónde están? Well, if you have uncles or fathers or brothers like my dad, he was filled with woundedness, and I didn't understand at the time. So today we're going to present a little bit of both sides. And then next week, in the next session, we're going to focus on woundedness. because many of us, and you all too, work with men that are wounded in areas of, domestic violence and child abuse and sexual assault, gang violence, all of those reactions to the wounds that are inside, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that next time. And then the final session, we're going to talk about how do we work together on this? How do we bring healing that way? So let's go to the slides. If we can pull up the slides, and I'm going to, here we go. So we begin by just acknowledging that healing medicine that's within inside of us. And it really is that concept of la cultura. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, there's those guys there. Share a little about who we are. Next slide, please. But who are we, right? Who are we, and where do we come from? And and I want to begin by, I'm a clinical psychologist by trade, but actually a lot of the teachings I grew up with, and as I was growing up in South Central LA and Compton and Watts, had a lot of questions about life, about how things were going, how people were treated, my own family, my own dad, my mom, myself. I was growing up in the 50s, 60s when the riots or the blowouts happened in Watts, and really saw the injustice and saw all of that, and saw how Black and brown men were treated, and felt a reaction to that, as a young boy going to school, and during those blowouts, National Guard around the corner, and me and my African-American friend Tyrone walked by, they clicked the AK-47, and we tightened up, It's like, dude, should we go to school? What, hey, we got to go to school. And my mom said, I got to go. And we walked to school all tight, all afraid, very, very, traumatized, if you will. Got to school, my legs started shaking, and wondering, should I be there? And I didn't learn nothing that day because I wasn't even there. I mean, I was there, but my spirit was someplace else. I was worried about my mom, my grandma, but my body was tight, and when I got home, I had difficulty eating, and that night, just wow, couldn't sleep real well. And so I come from that. And grew up then trying to figure that out. And as I began my work early on, realized that the systems and their programs were not really about healing. We were about categorizing or diagnosing or medicating or incarcerating or deporting, but not about healing. And so after I began doing work, I was a first male staff member at an organization called the East LA Rape Hotline, now known as the East LA Women's Center. And in there, I really saw this pain. I saw this pain of violence that was going on. And what really troubled me is, as much as I loved my culture and loved my people and knew my history and advocated and marched and everything for the essence of our cultural integrity, what was bothering me inside is a lot of the people that I was seeing that were hurting women and children were men that looked like me. And there were no programs, there was no services that were in our language, and the programs that were there didn't meet our culture and didn't understand the whole issues of culture and violence, and what I understand now, racism and oppression and misogyny and patriarchy. Didn't understand any of that. They just wanted to either medicate us or lock us up or deport us or take our kids away, and so they became ashamed about that. And as a clinician, as a practitioner, I was stuck between what the system wanted me to do and what I knew the community needed to do. And when I talked to the women, they didn't want their husband or father or brother locked up or deported or kicked out. They just wanted him healed, and nobody was doing the healing. And so in 1988, I called other men. We called other men and said, hey, they're not doing it, we got to do it ourselves. And we're going to develop programs and practices and everything, and so that they're culturally relevant, that they help heal. And 19 men came together. And to be honest, there was back then in 1988, that was an unusual thing to bring, Latino and Native men together to just gather. And even some of my friends said, man, you put on the flyer, no alcohol. We can't drink, like even after me. No, man. Oh, I don't know if I can go a whole weekend. And what are we gonna do? Just gonna meet? What we're gonna do? We're just gonna talk? What? And there was no real agenda. And so a lot of people that other practitioners, because there were lawyers and doctors and social workers and therapists and community advocates and healers there that wanted to come, and some just thought it was strange, but we came together for 3 days and we began with a conocimiento, meaning who are you? Because some of us didn't know each other, some of us, were from different places, and who are you and why are you here? What's your intention? And we knew enough because our grandmas had taught us that everything that's important, you start, with prayer. You start asking for help. You start asking for your grandmas and grandpas to help you. And we did that. We know how to do that in a good way. And so then we passed that palabra around, and the third brother in then shared that, he wants to, he's who he was, and he wants to really develop programs and stuff for to heal men and heal boys and, all of that. And he says, but what I'm really thinking about now is myself. So I'm a therapist myself. He says, but I don't know how to love my kids. I don't know how to love my wife. I just bury myself in my work and I'm all jacked up. And he began to cry. And it was really strange for us, men to see this man cry like that. But then he went deeper and he says, I've never said this to nobody, never shared with nobody. He says, what's really bothering me is something that happened to me when I was a little kid. I was abused starting in age 6. And he really began to cry, like crying, like when he couldn't talk, like crying, and he could feel his spirit just kind of opening up like that. And when that happened, it was like, whoa, 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 whoa. And all of us in that room started to cry. We all started to cry. And then we went around the room, and all of us were the leaders. Remember, we're the therapists, we're the lawyers, we're the advocates, we're the teachers, we're the leaders. And all of us began to cry, and all of us shared the woundedness that we had never talked about, that we have never shared. Or we were told in society, just get your, just do good, don't get in trouble, don't get locked up, stay away from the drugs, stay out of gangs, get your degree, get your credential, and, make good money, and everything be fair and equal. And what we began to realize is no matter what we did, no matter how successful we were, no matter how good of a person we were still looked at a certain way. And all of those wounds, all of those microaggressions and direct aggressions that have faced us, but not just us, had faced our fathers and our grandfathers, were all locked up inside of us. And as much as we were professionals and doing work, we hadn't dealt with that. So we made a decision that day, that the most revolutionary thing we could do is to heal ourselves. That if we really wanted to be honorable men, if we really wanted to recover the sacredness, because what we also acknowledged, there was a lot of woundedness in our families, that our fathers were wounded, that many times our brothers or tios, and some of our own actions were not even respectful or appropriate. And so put a mirror in front of us to say how to return to that. And as part of our whole, discovery is we recognize that in our ancient writings that were written in Nahuatl sometimes and other languages, indigenous languages, there were principles, there were teachings of how do you be an honorable person. But we had to recover that, discover that, uncover that, and then we had to choose to live it. And that was the beginning of the Círculo de Hombres in the National Compadres Network over 30 some years ago. And we made a pledge that we would heal ourselves, we would reach out to other men, sometimes meaning we had to challenge them, make them accountable. But we were going to do it with love, and we're going to do it with accountability. And then the next thing is pass it on to the next generation. Next slide. So this is a little bit about where we've been. Ozzy, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you, Maestro. And I just wanted to mention something that I've heard you share in many instances that you see as a reflection of this Círculo of Hombres that was initiated over 30 years ago. And that is to say that, in your words, that the most revolutionary thing that we can do before we continue to be of service and be of service to communities is to first do our own work.
Yeah.
And I think that's worth mentioning, because many of us, do the work, have been assigned to the work, advocate and show up. And sometimes we forget that, sometimes we need to do that work at home, right? We need to do that work for ourselves. So that puts us in a better place to support others. And so where we've been, as Maestro Jerry has mentioned, the organization has been doing this work for over 30 years. We continue to inform the field, right? On how do we acknowledge trauma? How do we acknowledge woundedness, but to do it from a standpoint that is healing centered, right? To acknowledge that, yes, in spite of all of what we face, what we've experienced, all of the sacrifices, the known, the unknown, that we know that the healing medicine is within us. And so part of our role as an organization is to continue to share light on what we know works, right? To reclaim those traditional values that we know exist across many cultures, all cultures, but sometimes we create a distance, right? We become disconnected. And so there's a lot that we've learned on a personal note when I was reflecting on these questions and thinking about what is important for me to share with all of you that are listening. And one of the things that I like to share is that, I came into this work, as Maestro has mentioned, as a teen father, someone who didn't see themselves living past 15, let alone 18, let alone 21, and now into my 40s. And when you are raised in such a way that contributes to hopelessness, right? The inability to see past tomorrow, the inability to see into the future, is that oftentimes we don't prepare for it. So part of my own personal growth and what we help to highlight, to showcase, is that work that oftentimes we need to do, in our own personal lives, to move from the theoretical, the conceptual, to the practical implementation, right? How do we show up in our relationships with our significant others? How do we show up as fathers, right? To be nurturing, to be loving. And so part of our work is to continue to inform the field, to broaden the work, right? But also including doing this work within educational institutions. How do we ensure that as educators are spending the majority of their time working with many of our children, that they do it from a place that honors who they are, that honors their culture, that honors all of the wisdom that exists in the stories and in the proverbs and the dichos that oftentimes in many spaces when we walk in, we leave those behind, right? So part of the work of the National Compadres Network is to do that and to identify, where are the healers in the communities? Because we know that they exist. And they don't have to carry an accolade or a certification or a doctorate, but it's the abuelitos and the abuelitas, the dones and the doñas, that oftentimes we neglect to acknowledge them as true maestros. And so our work is to do that, is to recognize that we have them within our communities, but also within our families. And how do we create opportunities to give them a role so that they can support this work?
Next slide, please. We recognize that, this is, and you may not have seen your child development theory presented this way, but this is a circle of life. If you learn ages of stages of development, Erickson, it may have been hierarchical, and our traditional way recognize it's circular. And we recognize that, childhood, we all go through these different stages, but do we experience the same things? Do we experience the very same thing? But the other thing that we recognize, and now it's being proven, we knew it all along, my abuelita would talk about this, but we also recognize is that if you have come from a lineage, from people that have been wounded and traumatized, enslaved, if you will, tortured, oppressed, raped, and if your great-great-grandma was wounded like that and never got a chance to heal, it impacts her physiologically, emotionally, spiritually. So when she raises her kid, and raise him that way, but my abuelito too, because if he was tortured and all that, then he's going to be afraid, and he may be more rigid with his way he guides or says things. And I saw that in my own dad, que era un hombre bien, loud talk. Hey, mijo, ven acá, get in. What's the matter with you? My friends goes, your dad, man? Oh, that's the way he talks all the time, dude. It's like, and I kind of trip if a social worker would come in my house. Better send him to anger management. Actually, that's when my dad was fine, when he talked loud, But if somebody from the outside sees my dad speaking that way, and if you work with men that work in factories or work in, the fields, they got to talk loud. You got to talk loud. If you grow up in a neighborhood where you gotta show that, hey, don't mess with me. Sometimes you got to be loud. It doesn't mean you're violent, just mean you're trying to survive. So not everybody's experience, in childhood is the same. And even as little boys, right? As little boys, does this world, this society treat little African-American boys, little Mexicano boys the same as they do others? I will show you the stats that will show you they don't. I will show you the suspension and expulsion rates of little boys, little Black and brown boys that get kicked out, get expelled, get diagnosed, get medicated 10 times higher than other kids. So early on, if you began to get categorized, if you began to be seen like that, how does that affect you? And you even thinking that you're honorable, that you can be honorable? Who begins to identify who you are, and begins to, if you will, put a spell or a certain label on you? Some of you, as we're going to present, even the thing Sacred Manhood is like, what is that? We're going to talk about machismo. We're going to talk about the true sense, of Hombre Noble. And some of you have never heard this. You've been working in fields, you've been working with men how many years, and you've never seen it. Why have you not seen this? Why has this not been part of your understanding? And with the demographics going to where it's going, where, Latino children, Mexicano children, Chicano children, are the majority 0 through 5. They wouldn't be the highest population growing up. And it really behooves organizations and systems to really understand this, right? So we begin to understand that, and fortunately, in growing up, we recognize also that there's teachings. Regardless of where you grew up, there were teachings. And we recognize there's lo bueno y lo malo, there's the night and the day, there's the blessing teachings, and then there's the tough teachings. Sometimes the painful teaching, we learn from both, right? Doesn't mean you're dysfunctional because you have those painful teachings. We all have those challenges that way, right? And our goal really is in working and being men, being fathers, grandfathers, tíos, is really to heal, those wounded teachings, those false teachings that were given to us about who we were, right? And to begin then to expand. And if you look at this circle, there's also at the 4 quadrants, if we were to put the other chart up, there's the physical, there's the emotional, there's the mental, and there's the spiritual, right? And often the physical, mental is categorized for males. Well, that's not true. That is the masculine, but it's not for males. And usually the emotional, spiritual is seen as the female. No, that's the feminine. And what we categorize as honorable sacred manhood is that ability to include and engage all aspects of your physical, of your emotional, of your mental, and your spiritual. Unfortunately, growing up in the barrio in Compton and growing up in an oppressive racist society, sometimes you don't want to feel. And the pressures are so much that your spirit gets diminished and told you don't have a spirit, que no vales para nada, that your people are nothing, that your people are not worthwhile, and the spirit of your identity then gets lost. Next slide. Ozzy?
So as we look at sacred manhood, it's really about the counter narrative to what many people have adopted as defining manhood. And then we look at living our lives in such a way that honors all of our relations, the people whom we come across with, the people who were responsible for guiding, for overseeing, so that we can recover, right? Those teachings that Maestro spoke about, the ones that maybe were put away, the stories that exist that didn't get to make it to this generation. How do we recover all of that? Looking at the true definition of what it is to be a man. And for me, and how I've been defining manhood for me, is that first and foremost, it's rooted in the respect of women and the respect of children in all our relations. That it's not based on being egotistical, that it's based on how do we honor all of those people that we're connected to, right? Recognizing that, yes, I am worthy of being loved. Yes, I am worthy of being welcome and wanted, right? That those teachings insist within our culture. And that sometimes, some of us who were raised not having those teachings, that we struggled, right? That we maybe adopted more popular ways and definitions, and oftentimes strived at those things, but recognizing that oftentimes we hurt people, right? So part of sacred manhood is identifying what are those values, what are those things that support us in being good men, all of us who identify as being men, and how does that then translate in our interactions with our families and our loved ones, right? To ensure that whatever woundedness was passed down inadvertently by our relatives, by our parents, that we ensure to do our work so that we don't pass that on to the next generation. And not just the next generation, but also in working with today's generation, right? Reclaiming those values so that we can undo, redo, or better do how we show up for folks.
Next slide, please. you know, I alluded to this, but I really we wanted to put this up here because people don't even know this and don't recognize, you know, that, you know, we talked about a pandemic and we lost a whole lot of people and people were not able to grieve and people were not able to, you know, but I want you to imagine, you know, 20 to 60 million of our people killed, raped, abused, you know, taken off your land, taken from your land. They're the very things that help to keep you strong and healed, saying you can't do them. You can't pray that way. You can't be that way. You can't use those values. Those traditions are not good. And those things are still going on because Ozzy mentioned about school. Our kids are getting indoctrinated in a whole different way. And so, oh, that's not important for your success and your education, you know. And, you know, and I remember even, I mean, very practically as, you know, I was like in second grade and they're telling me I have rights and I should share my feelings and express myself. And, you know, and I go home and my dad says, hey, tira esa basura, throw that trash. And I decide to share my feelings with my dad. Hey, Dad, I got rights. I want to express myself. Hey, oh, he would put up his hand. I'm going to show you a right here, cabrón. You know, and there's a clash, you know. And but nowadays, you know, we have taken those values and those traditions and not even attempted to balance them out. What does that mean? What needed to go on to balance out the two worlds, right? So we've been indoctrinated in false teachings sometimes, right? Colonized thinking of what is a man? What is truly un hombre? You know, what does it really mean? And if we have no place to share, to dialogue, to teach, to learn from, and to be able to distinguish between the honorable and that which is wound-based, right? Then we will actually go with what helps us survive. And especially if we live in a society that reinforces, remember the colonization, we're going to reinforce your negative so you don't want to be like you. So you're going to hate who you are. So you're not going to even like people like you that look like you, right? And that's that colonized thing. And then you're going to hurt those people that you even love when they question that, right? So you know, we recognize that these are the barriers. Next slide. You know, that we as men, and then the question becomes, you know, what happens, you know, Ozzy?
Thank you, Maestro. And you know, I reflect back on how all of these things that we're talking about here today impacted, you know, how I showed up, right? And what contributed to that woundedness that then in acting out hurt others, right? So when we look at what happens when society doesn't see you, you know, there's many of us, primarily a people of color, when we enter spaces where we're not seen, right? And me being 6 foot tall, how can you not see me? How can you not acknowledge me, right? And then there are narratives that get created that pin us against each other. You know, when we share in neighborhoods, when we share in community, and we share, none of us live in isolation, right? We can isolate ourselves, which is different, but none of us live in isolation. We live in community. And when we're not seen, when our neighbors not seen, when our partners, our homies, our camaradas are not seen, oftentimes creates and contributes to racism, right? Where we're fighting to be seen. And we do things to get recognized, but sometimes not necessarily to be recognized or acknowledged in a healthy way, right? But rather to be seen as a stereotype, right? What happens when we don't have these teachings, right? And we receive generational trauma. I oftentimes get reminded of the work that I want to support my mother in doing. You know, my mother is now in her late 60s. And I've always remember going to class and elementary and teachers and educators would say, well, if your parents love you, that they should be able to tell you that they love you. And I would go home and I'd say, you know, being raised by my mom as a single mom, raising 2 children, there was no time to say, mijo, te quiero, right? And then have to think about, well, does she really love me? Because what I'm hearing them say is that if she doesn't express it verbally, that she must not love me, right? And then how does that manifest then when I have to express love to my children, to my partners, in my relationships, right? Reminds me that there are some things that we inadvertently take on that get passed on. It's important that if we have an opportunity to sit with others and reflect, is to say, what is the work that I need to do so that I don't contribute to that, right? That instead of passing on generational trauma, that we pass on generational blessings. To be able 6 generations forward to say, you know, I'm glad that my tata way back there did his work so that when we gather as a family, we gather in peace, we gather in a nonviolent way, we gather in a place that makes us feel safe, that acknowledges who we are, and that we can share that as a part of who we are in our culture, right? I think about growing up in the community of South Central and in poverty, and talking about practical things where back in the day in the 80s, and those of us that lived in poverty and didn't have the resources for, maybe you had the washer, but you didn't have the dryer. And so that meant you washed the clothes, but you used the clotheslines. And then the next morning you go to iron the clothes to pick up that, and that clothes is not there, right? And the lack of resources of going to bed feeling hungry, right? How does that contribute to how we see ourselves or how we show up to others? And so it's also important to acknowledge that there have been systems that have been created and designed not to allow us to prosper, not to allow us to move forward, right? When we talk about the school to prison pipeline, even to include the separation of families, right? Not acknowledging what happens to that small child, to that family unit when a child gets removed, of thinking, when will I see him or her again? And thinking about the times that my mom, when she came to this country, and she'd have to cross the border, that she would leave me with the tios. And she'd go on to say, mijo, well, we'll see you in a couple of days. And as a 4 or 5-year-old boy, I used to say, well, what do you mean see you in a few days? Like, you're my mom, you're all I've got, the only person I can hold on to. And then for a few days, not knowing when I would see my mom, right? If that day would come. And so it's important that as we're working with communities, knowing that they're impacted by all of these many things, is that we create a consciousness, right, of how that may manifest. And sometimes it shows up in woundedness. And part of our role responsibility is to remind us of our sacredness, that in spite of what has happened, in spite of our mistakes, let's reclaim true manhood so that we can show up in a good way for our relations.
Thank you, Ozzy. As we're speaking, I want to, just recognize that in reality, what we're talking about in the sacredness, and we've been asked to talk about manhood today, but we're really talking about honoring people in their totality in the way they are. And we don't live in a binary. We live people that are on a various spectrum of having different identities. And so there's men with identification with strong femininity or along the spectrum as well. And there's fathers that carry two-spirit within them, but all of that, when we invite men and male identified people to our circles that way, you come as you are, you come with all of yourself. Let's honor all of you so that you can then honor all of those relationships with your children and whatever they come with, But again, living in a society that really wants to, categorize us, it makes it very, very difficult, And then you have the day-to-day stuff, right? Because we assume us dads, and when I was a dad, even though I was teaching fatherhood and parenting, then they send you the kids that don't pay attention to those lessons, And then what do you do, And it, reminded me of a time when I was a little boy, and all of this kind of speaks to that. I was a little boy with my dad to the store. He's gonna go buy some milk for my sister's bottle, and we went to the little corner store. They didn't have no milk there, so we had to go over to the other side of town where people that didn't look like us were and didn't want us there were there. And my dad walks in, loud voice and his hat and he walks in, puts the milk down, and the guys weren't coming. They were playing cards, and my dad said, "Hey, I want to pay for this milk. Can I go?" And one of the guys looks up and says, "That's a stupid Mexican, make him wait." He didn't think we heard, but he said to the other guy, and they started laughing. And then I said, "Hey, can I pay for this milk? I gotta go," And the other guy looks, "Oh, they're used to sitting in the cactus all day long." They start laughing, And as a little boy, I'm thinking, why are they saying this stuff about my dad? Why are they saying this, man? And why doesn't my dad do anything? Could dad kick their ass? I mean, I was saying it in my head. I wasn't saying it to him, And finally, the man came, and my dad put the money down. The guy threw the change down. Some landed on the floor, and I went to pick it up, looked at my dad's eyes. And I saw the shame that his boy had heard this, this boy but at the time he got up, it looked from shame turned to hardness. "Come on, let's go. I'm gonna." But in school, I'm learning to use my words. So I decided to ask my dad a question. "So, Dad, why do you let those men say those ugly things about you?" And he hits me in the back of the head. But why do you let them say that people are not supposed to call other people bad names? Why do you let them be quiet? You understand? Let's go. And then I said something to my dad that I wish I could take away. I said, "Dad, but if you were really a man, you wouldn't let those men fray. I don't know. Shut up. Let's get out of here." And I challenged my dad's manhood. What was my dad feeling at that moment? What was he feeling inside? This little boy watching, hearing this, I'm questioning him. And he says, shut up. And I didn't understand at that time that, don't ask me. I don't even know. Because if he would have done what I wanted him to do, kick those guys out, the cops or the migra, somebody would have come, taken him away, then he couldn't work the 2 jobs. He couldn't work the 2 jobs, he wouldn't get fed. So what did my dad do? Suck it up. But he didn't have the words to explain it to me. And I didn't have the words. So we walked home without talking. Some of you have worked in the field for 10, 20 years. You've never talked about this. You work in systems that fund men's work, fatherhood, domestic, but you've never talked about this. If you haven't talked about our population, you equally haven't talked about my African-American relatives, my Asian relatives, my Native folks. Well, we have the words now. We have the programs, we have the curriculum, and you're still not why. I want to put the reflection in from you as we're talking about it, because as I walked down that street, I looked up at my dad and I said, man, I don't want to be like you. Shame. You can't handle business. And there was a disconnection that happened there. It's that disconnection that builds woundedness that we'll talk about next time. So we get home, my dad puts the milk on that. ¿Qué tienes su leche to my mom? My mom said, what's the matter with you? Nah, déjame, dímelo. My dad goes to the refrigerator, brings it. There's another issue, right? What do? There's no health care. There's no medical care. I just did a memorial service on Saturday. And there was a number of Mexicano Latino men after I spoke about the death of one of their brothers. And they're calling, I want to go to therapy. And I said, well, here's some resources. The guy calls me back. There's a 4-month wait. This guy's in crisis now. So the inequity still exists. It's not like we don't want to heal. It's not like we don't want to do better. But is the system ready for us? Is the programs ready for us? Are the staff that you have, can they connect? Next slide. Fortunately, fortunately, we're going to move the slide. In spite of the challenges, all men want to be good fathers, Ozzy.
Mm-hmm. And this reminds me, Maestro, of when I look at this, that in spite of the challenges, it reminds me of how for some of us men who were raised in such a way in our families and in our communities and our homes, where they said, "Los hombres no lloran," right? That men don't cry, and I've come to learn that there was a reason why. Oftentimes, young boys were told that, and my understanding is that we have to recognize that we're going to face challenges. There's going to be adversity. We're going to have to push back on some things, and sometimes when things get heavy, it requires you to hold on to some of those tears, right? To hold on to those emotions, but it doesn't mean that you hold on to them forever, right? And I think what has happened for some of us is we never got that second part of the teaching. That, mijo, after you're done holding on to it, you need to be able to release it. You need to be able to let it go. Because what ends up happening is when you don't let it go, is that it manifests in such a way in which we show up with a lack of patience, with a lack of understanding, right? That we show up with our chest pumped out, right? With our eyebrow up. And that's because there's a manifestation that's occurring in our body from being able to hold on to all of these. We know that for many of our communities, especially Black and brown communities, that many of our people will take their tears to the grave, never ever allowing themselves that opportunity to be able to let go, to release. Because if any one of us that's on this call, however you self-identify, you've ever had a good cry, that feel that sense of, can't believe I've been holding on to that for over 40 years. Right? And what I've learned from my elders is that when you begin to release, when you begin to be able to let go of all of those things that brought you tears, that pain, that suffering, the injustices, the racism, the oppression, discrimination, deportation, you name it, right? That when you begin to do that healing and let go, that it then creates a space and opportunity for the blessings to come in, right? And the blessings to sit in, because I believe, and I may be biased in saying that all men want to be good men. right? That some of us just have to be redirected. Some of us just have to be reminded that we know what it is to show up in a good way, right? And to be able to have living examples like Maestro Jerry here to say, I know what that looks like. Not only do I know what that looks like, I have a connection to somebody who knows how to honor themselves and honor their relationships, right? And that is significant. And so part of what the work that we contribute to is, you know, identifying that some of us need to do our own work. And I want to be responsive, Maestro, if I can, to the question put on the chat about how do we challenge and or invite others, primarily men, into this work. And I will always share that when we have platforms like this, at least for me, the work is fairly easy because we're talking to the choir, we're talking to like-minded folks, we're talking to people who are of service to others. But sometimes the hardest work is at home. When you have relatives who say things that are sexist, who say things that are inappropriate, and you can call them out. I like to suggest and invite others, how do we do that in a respectful way? How do we say to that relative, you said some things out loud, you know, can we have a side conversation? You know, because I'm in connection and relationship with you and want to continue to invite you to these gatherings, right? Can we work on what you said? Because that's not how I'm raising my family. More importantly, that's not how I'm raising my boys. And if we want to be in connection, because we're in friendship, we're relatives and want to continue to see each other, can we commit to working on this together and walking this way together, right?
Yeah. You know, as you're speaking, remind me, I had a tío that every time I walked in his house, hey, you want a beer? And you know, and I had grown up with a dad that drank and had a problem with alcohol. And, you know, whenever my dad drank, every time I hear I get nervous because sometimes it'd be good and that's when he'd give us money. But sometimes that's when, you know, he'd get mad at my mom and yell at her and they'd fight and stuff like that. So every time I heard that alcohol, you know, that beer can open, I got nervous, you know. So I made a choice, you know, when I had my kids not to drink, you know, that alcohol wasn't going to be part of that, you know, and that was my transformation, my recovering the sacredness. But every time I go to his house, hey, you want a beer? Not the you think you're better than me, huh? You're not drinking. Oh, you got the college degree. You think you're becoming, you know, a white dude, man. You ain't Mexicano, or, you know. And he would challenge me every time, you know. I'd still go visit him and put up with it, you know. And one day I went to his house, and I took a 6-pack, and took a 6-pack of beer for him, and I took some sodas for me. I said, I'm gonna drink with you, but I'm not gonna drink that. But Theo, if you allow me to tell you why. Why you're gonna criticize me and say I'm alcoholic? No, I'm not gonna say any of that, Theo. I'm just gonna tell you why I don't do that. And I shared with him my fear every time my dad opened that beer. Every time that would happen in me, and my stomach tightened up. And sometimes I'd worry, and at night when I hear me yell at my mom, I couldn't sleep. And you know, and I said, you know, Theo, it's you know, I love my dad and everything, but you know, I didn't love that part of him. And I don't want my kids to go through that. You know, it's your choice, Theo. If you got to do that, okay, I respect you. But, you know, please don't look bad at me if I'm not drinking beer with you. I'm not going to criticize. That's what you got to do. See, and I did that because I didn't understand his pain. You know, sometimes there's no healthcare, there's no medication, there's no referrals, there's 3 months waiting, little shit. You drink a 40, you know, and I'm just going to be real. You know, sometimes that's better than taking your violence out on somebody else. I'm not saying that's the best way, but you know, so, but in talking with my Theo like that, he stopped, and at one, he looked at me. And he said, Mico, tienes razón. He says, yeah, I know I have a problem. I don't know how to stop, you know, and I don't know if it's too late to stop. I mean, you know, and there's a whole story that goes along with that. But what Ozzy was talking about is how do you connect? How do you invite people in? How do you, rather than shaming or blaming, you know, that's why we, you know, really encourage us to have service providers and people that look like, that have experienced, that have gone through, because it's not about shame and say, brother, I know exactly where you're at. I can feel where you're at. Yes. You know, and I wish when I was at your place, somebody would have told me this or did this for me, you know, and that's why, you know, one of the main things we have in the compadres is the círculos, hombre men's circles all over the place, ongoing, you know, that are open that way, you know, because that's where we can show the example, but also we can deal with the woundedness too. Next slide.
And I'll mention this in closing, just my thought, Maestro, before I hand it over to you, that part of that initial question was, what do you do with those that are not willing to walk with you, right? And that's a reality. There's a reality that some people will say, well, I'm not ready to go there with you, right? I still gotta work on myself or do my own things. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge because oftentimes, these are your relatives. These are my relatives. And how do I say to my father-in-law, well, if you're not willing to work on these things, well, then maybe we need to put a pause on you coming over, right? Maybe we need to put a pause on a relationship, right? What if it's a childhood friendships existed for over 20 years, and somebody says these things that are inappropriate, that are contrary to what we're talking about, sacred manhood, and sometimes it will require for us to say, well, then this is as far as we're going to walk together for now, right? Because this is the way and the values that I'm trying to instill in my family. This is the walk that I choose to walk with, and if you're not willing to walk with me, then maybe we need to part ways. And that's difficult to do. That is very difficult to do, right? Because you still want to honor that connection. You want to honor the lived experiences that we've had, the many stories that we've created. But can we work together to create healthy ones?
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah, even though it's necessary to do that, we don't stop praying for people. We don't stop texting them. Hey, brother, you want to come to the Círculo? Hey, I got this going on. There's a presentation. Check it out. We still don't stop trying. They're still related to us. They're still connected. But there are those situations, and it's not just relatives. I've had professionals that we have to check, and we have to bring, but we do it in a loving way. And some people will acknowledge it, and then be willing to address it, and others are so steeped in their pain that they're and so then we have to go to a protective mode of a secondary way of doing things. But the benefits is breaking cycles of disconnection. And throughout the 30 some years I have been associated, been in Círculo, been in ceremony, been in dialogue, been in with work with thousands and thousands and thousands of honorable men, of all nationalities. And we've sat together and prayed, and it's not that people don't fall and they don't mess up, but they have a place to go back to. It's not that we don't struggle and we don't err, or sometimes because the colonization of the patriarchy exists in our society, and it's reinforced every day. So there has to be a consciousness for us to rebuild the traditions, maybe not the way that they were in our families. We've rebuilt, and so they've rebuilt traditions where they have the same intent, but they're not oppressive. And then we have to recover sacred relationships. So make sure that the relationships are sacred. They're not hierarchical, but they're circular, where everybody has a lugar and everybody, and when men and fathers and families and mujeres and abuelitas, everybody do better, the children do better. They do better, even though they're getting indoctrinated every day in a very different mentality, a Western, sometimes, oppressive way. And so that becomes the clash many, many times. But when you are intent on living your true values, at least you have some traditions and ways of dealing with it in a good way. Next slide. Ozzy, you want to take this next slide?
So it's important, as you mentioned earlier, Maestro, that as we do this work, that we create opportunities for people to bring in their culture, right? The stories that have supported us, the values, the proverbs that exist across many cultures, right? Acknowledging that, yes, that we have experienced adversity and challenges, but how do we lead that work as a practitioner, as somebody who's holding space for others, who's walking with someone, to do it from the mindset of how do we then acknowledge what has happened and use that as a stepping stone to move forward, to bring healing. And healing has become a very popular term over the past few years. I remember many, many years, because I've been walking with Maestro for over 20 years, where healing didn't make it into the proposal. When you would look for funding, and they would say, well, what is this thing about healing? And now we live in a society where it becomes, a term that is popular. It's complex. It's sometimes difficult for some folks to understand. But healing can simply be, let me just acknowledge that I've gone through some things. right? And sit with it. And then if I can be supported by other individuals, right? You can say, I too, have witnessed that. I too have had that experience. How do we work together to begin to heal that? And that healing comes in many different forms, that there's healing in your tears just as much as there is in your laughter, right? That sometimes when I think back of how did I make it here today in 2022, I have to laugh at, man, that there was a lot of pain and woundedness back there. What's significantly important for me to share is that I have had the resources to be connected with a lot of hombres nobles, with another noblemen, with sacred manhood values that have walked with me, and that in my challenges reminds us of, in our true culture, those values exist. How do we honor our relations? How do we honor women, right? How do we not bring violence to our home? How do we not expose our children to violence, right? And that sometimes in order to do that work, is we got to start with ourselves.
Next slide. So we come to this concept of la cultura cura, right? And really it is about recognizing, we live in a society that believes that, the white Western society, they're the one that invents everything, and you got to get certified and evaluated and evidence-based from them in order for things to be valuable and for them to be appropriate and them to be, but what we recognize is that everyone, every culture, and some of us come to 2 or 3 roots, and that's wonderful. If you got, 3 different cultures, bring all the grandmas with you, acknowledge all of their teachings, But we recognize that my grandma, my abuelita, that was 4'10", only spoke Spanish, spoke some of her native language too, that she had wisdom. I mean, how can you you tell a woman that had 14 kids that she don't know what she's doing, but yet many times in Western society, oh, you got to go to a parenting class, you got to do this, and and maybe that's for skill development, but my grandma had her ways and her teachings, and every culture has their ways and teachings. And like we said, I don't want to make this Pollyanna, because they're the positive things, and then there are things that come from the conquest and from the woundedness and the oppression. So it's what Ozzy said is about acknowledging, right? The dignity, love, trust, and respect. And within that wisdom, we then begin to differentiate what are those things we need to carry on, and what are those things we need to cleanse and let go of, in order that we can then have that beautiful, harmonious tomorrow, right? And there's teachings, that are very, very important, that are really, really important in part of our process. And what I've learned over the years, that there's 4 basic concepts, 4 basic teachings that indigenous and culturally based folks integrate in their lives, in their relationships, in raising children and everything. Next slide. Ozzy.
So those teachings that you're speaking about, Maestro, are really what's rooted at the work of our National Compadres Network organization, and the way that we do our work is when we look at protective factors, right? If you create a home, an environment, a space, whether this is in your organization, whether this is in your home, it's ensuring that people feel that sense of being wanted, because many of us who've experienced oppression and racism is contrary to not feeling wanted, right? Not feeling welcome, feeling out of place, right? That sense of not having a sense of belonging or acceptance. So part of our work is really, how do we show up not just in our personal, but also in our professional work, to ensure that as we're working with families and communities, is that we're creating that sense of being wanted, that all of us are a blessing. And in the work that we do around education and educational institutions, is I oftentimes ask the question, if those of us that are parents, my belief is that all of us as parents see or saw our children as sacred. And that's real easy for me to reference when my children were newborns, and you held them in your arms. And some of us don't even take them outside, because you don't want that wind to hit that child and potentially get an earache, or that child, because that's how fragile and how sacred that life is. At what point do our children stop being sacred? Do we then stop seeing them as a blessing? And it is unfortunate to say that I hear of stories and instances in which 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds looking at Head Start, kindergarten, who are not seen as a blessing. Maestro reminds us there's somebody's blessing, right? And if we saw somebody as a blessing, will we treat them differently? in our interactions, in our approach, in our practice, right? Reminding us that all of us have a sacred purpose, and that sacred purpose is always evolving, right? That we all have cultural teachings and teachings that we have to look for them. And if you're not connected to an elder, seek one out. And oftentimes it's a simple invitation to say, Tío, tía, nana, tata, can you share with me, what were those values that were central to when you were being raised, right? The stories of the antepasados, right? That within the story, we have those teachings that remind us of how we walk in a good way, honoring all our relations, right? Creating opportunities where people feel safe. And in sharing of ourselves, right? What shareable becomes bearable. How do we show up in a compassionate way, in a non-judgmental way, in a non-critical way? And we're not criticizing you, we're not judging you, but really to say, that I'm here for you. I may not know or have that similar experience. And so when young people, as Maestro says, reference, do you feel me, right? Do you feel me really means, do you have a sense of what I'm experiencing or have experienced? And if you do, how do you show up to support, communities? How do we show up and create spaces where people feel welcome and wanted?
Yeah, thank you, Ozzy. I want to invite you to share, what drew you to come back to that teen fatherhood. And it seems simple, and it seems culture doesn't have any meaning, but to someone that is wondering if they're wanted, if they have a sacred purpose, trying to find their culture and don't feel safe, really what seems like a very simple thing can have a profound effect.
So as I was sharing, what's been shared is I came into this work, which has now been my career for over 20 years. I came into this as a teen father. I remember sharing with my mom when I found out I was going to be a dad, and thinking that I had it all figured out, right? And she said to me, te crees muy hombrecito, like you think you're a man, and in my ignorance, right, thinking that I had it all figured out, I came to realize that I was going to fall flat on my face, that what I thought manhood and fatherhood was about, I didn't have a true reference for it. But the reason why I can say that I'm still here today and doing this work, and who I can accredit that to, in addition to Maestro Jerry and other men, is Bobby Lee Verdugo, one of my mentors, may he rest in peace, who was guiding this fatherhood program, and who was really the first man to ever call me mijo, right? And I remember him saying mijo, and I was like, well, I'm not your son. Like, well, you don't know me, I don't know you. Why is this extended kinship, right? But really, it was that I'm claiming you as my own, right? Like, I have a responsibility now in supporting you in your walk, not just as a young man and your growth and developing as a man, but also as a father, right? And sometimes some of us may question, some of us in our cultural inheritance, in our homes, how we demonstrate culture, we say mijo and mija, and you don't have to be blood related, right? It's that extended kinship. Can that also live in your organization? Will you express interest, commitment to someone else? Thank you for reminding me of that, Maestro.
Yeah. And I wish we could put up your picture at 15, because they don't look the same. The dude's, all bald headed, and he took off his jacket. You see the tats and all that, and mad dog and looking mean, but my brother Bobby, had that love in him. He saw through the woundedness to the sacredness of this little boy, because that who was showing up, that little insecure boy. And many times, even though we see men walking through the door, it's really that little boy that's scared, that doesn't know what to do, that maybe fronts up and pretends and acts tough and all of that, but really is wondering, am I going to be welcomed here? Whether I speak English or not, whether I write good or not, whether I, my tats, my ranchero hat, my, what am I supposed to do here? I don't know how to do this. And, and you ask people that are cultural teachers, what are you talking about cultural teaching? Because for many of our grandparents, it wasn't culture, it was life. This is the way it is. It's not culture, it's just life, And safety for many of our families is non-existent. We've been sheltering in place for generations because of, the oppression and racism. Next slide. So we come to now, wow, some of you can say, what? In the ancient writings, there's these principles, and this is, I'm sure, counter to everything you've ever thought about machismo. But if you understand the purpose of the conquistadores and the purpose of the oppressive narrative and the purpose of the patriarchy, it is to control, to stay in control. So you devalue others. You make what they do and you take what is woundedness and you make that their whole. So you create a narrative and show news media and talk about them, and from a presidency you can say that this is all they are, and you begin to create a narrative and begin to create fear and begin to create all this false narrative. And if you have no other alternative and no voice, then the children begin believing that's who they are too. And if there's no avenue for healing by a father or grandfather, they may act that out too. And now by the third generation, we believe this false sense of machismo, if you will, is who we truly are. And so therefore you have a choice. Either I deny my culture and I become something else, which you never really can, you can pretend to, or you adopt the false narrative and you begin acting it out. So this is a reintroduction of what we really need to be, right? And this is part of the core of what we begin then to cultivate and water. If you really want to be an hombre noble, if you really, then these really are the values. These is really are the action items, if you will, that way. Next slide, Ozzy.
And so to support and expand on what's being shared, when we look at, what is an hombre noble? What is a noble man? And what are the characteristics? What are the traits, right? And it's really, it's someone who honors their commitments, someone who is a person of their word, right? How do I ensure that I'm honoring my commitments, and my children, because these teachings live in my home, that when my children want to affirm that dad is really going to do what he says he's going to do, they don't just say pinky swear. They say, Dad, palabra, like, are we for reals? Like, can I hold you to it? Right? How beautiful would it be if we all honored our commitments in our relationships, to be faithful, to be nurturing, understanding, loving, patient, committed, right? To having follow through, right? The sense of responsibility, not only just for our well-being, but for the well-being of those that we're connected to. Oftentimes the example is given when we're struggling and the wounds, and people lead with their woundedness, will oftentimes say, well, who cares what happens to me? Who cares if I get locked up? Well, I'm here to remind us to say that when you get locked up, that there's a piece of your family that gets locked up with you. A piece of your mom gets locked up with you. If you have children, a piece of your children get locked up with you. So how do we ensure not only the well-being of us as individuals, but also the people that we're connected to? And wouldn't it be beautiful when we look at protective factors, if somebody honors that in us and we're struggling, that they exercise the responsibility to check in on us, right? To provide support, that rejects any form of abuse, physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual, to themselves or others, right? Takes time to pray, reflect, however you pray, to whomever you pray, whether that's through meditation, whether that's through the use of medicine, however it is, take an opportunity to give gratitude for another day of life, another opportunity, another day of breath that some maybe were not afforded today, right? And to reflect on I oftentimes say, what did I do yesterday or last week that I can work on improving this week or today, right? And to continuously do that work, right? As someone who is sensitive and understanding, is like a mirror reflecting support and clarity. That is not about judgment, not about criticizing. It's about acknowledging and recognizing that I see something happening. How do I show up to support, right? And if that were me, I'd appreciate somebody supporting me in this way, right? And to try to live these values honestly and with love, knowing that if these weren't inherited, if these weren't always present in your life, that you may struggle, as I did, to take these values on.
I want to thank you, Ozzy. I want to just acknowledge as we're moving through this, and both Ozzy and I mentioned our wives and I mentioned my mom and my abuelita, that healing is really feminine centered, and the women in our lives have really taught us. My grandma woke up at 4:30 in the morning, said her prayers, everything, then came to our room and blessed us all up, remind us that we're a blessing. It was the moms that really, if we mess up, they forgive us. If we get locked up, they go visit us. It's the mujeres that, pray for us and hope that we'll get better, So I want to, as we're talking about hombre, recognize that we are really centered in the honoring of women. And I want to, just say that directly, but also recognize in our traditions, in our, we're at the Sixto Sol. The Sixto Sol right now is said that's where the women must lead in order for our world to be at peace, for their healing, for the reconciliation, that it really is the feminine that's going to lead. And the women know this best. And I want to, personally thank the women in the movement, in the domestic violence movement, in the social justice movement, in all of these movements that have, taken time to, to be patient with us. I met Ruby at one of those national summits, and then we developed a national organization where men and women work together. And let me be honest, in the beginning, when us men were there, we weren't trusted. We had to earn the trust because there's been so much woundedness, and we recognize that too. So as we're talking about being an hombre noble, we also, I want to do it in this good way, but we say this to men: if you've hurt anyone, you need to acknowledge it. You need to commit to be different and accountable. Then you need to ask for forgiveness, because forgiveness is nothing in itself. Okay, I'm sorry I did that. If you're not going to be accountable and do something different, so we ask for the first two steps. Acknowledge what you've done. To be accountable and do something different, and then say, and I'm sorry. And so, from an elder's point of view, I want to just acknowledge, all the women and acknowledge and ask for forgiveness, for us men who have been wounded, because even though you're wounded, even though we have generations, 500 years of conquest and oppression, it still doesn't justify us being hurtful or violent or unfaithful or not following these principles. And so I want to apologize for that, but say that we're here to do the work. And I want to acknowledge the women in our organization. And we have a National Compadres Network that are very powerful. If you want to hear about the women and girls work, very, very powerful, with Maestra Deborah, Maestra Susie, and all the mujeres there, but we could not do this work without the mujeres' support, backing, and leadership that way. An hombre noble doesn't walk by himself. He walks actually watching the mirror of the women before us, and for that, I also want to advocate for the healing of women too, because we have a lot of moms that are raising boys, that are raising by themselves, and here is a marker of an hombre noble, but they can't do it alone either. So we're here to join with you and gather together and to, begin to, lift this up that way. Next slide. And I think our time is getting close.
Yes. And so part of this commitment, if I can, Maestro, just to speak to this slide, is as you were acknowledging the work that and the burden and responsibility that's been put on women to advocate for themselves and for healthy relationships, that there are men who are standing by waiting to receive an invitation, to support this work. But oftentimes, we struggle with how do we bring in men, right? How do we extend an invitation? So I know that all of you that are listening are connected to someone who can support, right? In creating healthy rites of passages, of dismantling patriarchy. But also, as Maestro was sharing around, asking for forgiveness, part of accountability is also saying, and I make a commitment to not ever do that again, right? So not only am I sorry, not only do we acknowledge, pero ya basta, ya estuvo. My commitment is not to do that again, right? And so here, there's two pledges that we've created at the National Compadres Network that potentially we can share as a resource for youth. And it outlists, what are some of those commitments, to be a person that understands that my most prized possession is the value of my word, and that I can use my words to tear somebody down, or I can use my words to build somebody up. Right. And in honoring my commitments, trust in me that I will show up for you. Right. Trust that I will walk with you. And by the same token, how do we support fathers, and being present for their children, right? And supporting them in whatever work they need to do so that, they can be there for their children. That oftentimes we have to remind ourselves that as busy as life gets, sometimes as a father, I will say, give me 5 minutes, 5 minutes becomes 10, becomes 15, becomes an hour, becomes 2 days, a week, or a month. How do we ensure to show up for our children? How do we work with fathers to sit down and read with their children as a way to advocate against violence, right? and supporting and building the capacity to speak up, against those issues that impact our communities.
So I think we have about 15 more slides, but we're not going to get to it, get to them. So it means you got to join us next time. We want to leave some time for, there's some questions. You see our website there. I also want to invite you. We have a podcast that we do about 108 episodes that we've done. And 1 week is I'm talking with elders. The next week is the maestras are talking about women's issues. Then there's a elders edition and also a youth edition, and it's on Healing Generations podcast. So if you go, you can look it up on Spotify or Apple or whatever, Healing Generations podcast. And then the other thing is some of these teachings I wrote in the recent book that I wrote called Recovering Your Sacredness. And you can look for that on my website or on Amazon or whatever. But the website there is National Compadres Network. We want to stop here and go full screen and see if there's any questions or reflections as we want to end it in time because we don't want to contribute to cultural stereotypes. We have trouble with time. So we'll see if there's any questions that.
There's a few questions that did come up in the chat.
Okay.
The first one is, would love to hear intentional strategies on how to call in the hermanos, amigos, and men in our life who need to be challenged and loved all at the same time. How do we do it intentionally? And what do we do when we just can't get through to some of them?
Yeah. Well, I would say a couple of things. I think the love comes before the challenge. So that, and for some of us, that may be difficult because they're doing some very challenging things. But I would, two things. One is there are videos, there are a lot of resources. You can look me up. I'm on YouTube a lot, and share those with them. Share this with the men in your lives. And sometimes hearing another man say certain things or reflect certain stories can open them up that way. The second thing is when you notice them doing, and it may be in the real challenge men, it may be rarely, but when you notice them doing something really good, then acknowledge it. Say, brother or Theo or uncle or whatever, and it's really nice the way I saw you talk to your daughter there. Really beautiful the way you, let them do that, or they, whatever that is, but be prepared. Because they are wounded, they might not even be able to accept that. That was a nothing. They may play it off. But to be familiar with resources too. We have círculos all over, and it would be great if we had more resources in communities just for any man to go. Not when they did something wrong, but just to come and gather at schools. Why aren't there groups just for men to gather, where all these things could be, taught? And we could have a place for men that are struggling can go to get support.
There are actually a few questions about the círculos. One is, are there groups or círculos held in Spanish for non-English speaking or limited English understanding? And who can sign up to these groups? And related to that is if there's a link to los círculos.
Yeah. So we do have círculos all over the country, but what we really recommend is that organizations invest in learning how to run círculos and bringing men together in your own community. We offer training and technical assistance capacity building. There's funders out there that should fund this, that should fund your organization training, building capacity, because we can do them, but wouldn't it be better for you all to have the capacity, for you bring some men from community that we can, integrate in, and they become part of a larger círculo, and then you have capacity in your organization. And yes, in Spanish, in English, we have some that are just in Spanish, some that are in English, some that are both, vienen que todo with everything, and we have very multicultural circles. We have a very strong relationship with the Brotherhood of Elders in Oakland, in which we do a lot of Black-Brown work, but also with other Asian and Alaskan and Native and other folks that we bring together in multicultural circles as well.
And speaking on trainings to how to run a circle, the last question is, will you be offering some of those trainings, and where would we find those? Yeah.
Well, again, you go to our website, you can request to get on the list of the trainings we offer. But again, I really want to encourage people to explore funding, offer trainings, because I know we're listening, people are listening across the country. And now that we're going more in person now, it's more powerful to do the trainings personally. Get funding, contact us, we'll come out and provide training, and that way you can actually bring in a network of people, and build a whole, if you will, Compadres Network, in your community, extended kinship network. In some communities, we have them, Black, Brown, Asian, Native, all as part of that network, so contact us, through our website, and we can provide avenues to do that.
That is all that I am seeing on the chat.
Okay. Ruby, is there anything else? Anything you want to highlight or mention or ask as we bring today to a close? You're on mute.
Sorry, I said no, I didn't want to add anything else. I wanted to appreciate you so much. I hope while you're speaking, you're able to see all the hearts and claps throughout your presentation, and even more now. As everybody thanks you so much. We are so happy to be in relationship with you, to be doing these webinars together with you, and we look forward to the next two that are coming up. We hope everybody will register for that, and just really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Ozzy, you want to close us out?
Just want to thank you, relatives, for allowing us to share a little bit of our story and what we see works. Please feel free to reach out to us. You can have our contact info via the website, and then we'll be working with NCAP to see how we can share other resources. So gracias, thank you.